So the past few years, this thing that is Two Sisters Flower Farm, it has taken a lot of different forms and it's operated on a lot of different levels. At first, for me, growing flowers was something that I did just for myself. It was purely a hobby. Then a short while later, that hobby turned into a sort of side hustle. You know, it was this little business that I had in conjunction with my normal full-time job. The money that I earned from selling flowers, while it provided an extra boost to my income, it was never enough where I could see myself doing it full time. Last year though, I made one of the biggest, and for me, one of the scariest leaps when I went all in on my business and officially became a full-time flower farmer. Now, when I say full-time flower farmer, what I really mean is that the net profit of my business, the total revenue that came in, minus the money that I spent on expenses, well, that resulting number was enough for me to live off of, to pay myself, to cover my personal expenses, you know, however you want to word it. And I can only speak to my experience, but defining myself as a full-time flower farmer, that didn't mean that my business was suddenly raking in 6 figures of profit. I think there's a lot of bold claims on the internet today, and it's not just specific to flower farming, but it's something that I hear brought up in regards to starting a business in general, of how people are going from nothing to earning top dollar and almost retiring in just a few short months. Now, I'm not saying that overnight success stories like those can't happen. I'm sure there are plenty of stories out there that do break the mold. But if I had to guess, I'd say that the majority of us are following a much different path and timeline. And that's my motivation for making this video. I want to give you a realistic look at how you can make flower farming your full-time gig if that's something that you want for yourself. So if you're curious and want me to break down how exactly I went from part-time flower grower to full-time flower farmer, let's not waste any more time and let's get right to it. Now, I realized that I could just share my story and sort of retrace my steps these past 5 or 6 years to give you a feel for what I've gone through and how I've gotten to where I'm at today. But I don't feel like that's the most helpful way to go about this topic. The reality is that there's a lot of different ways to define what a flower farm actually is, which means even though 2 people may share the same goal of becoming a full-time flower farmer, there's a lot of different paths those individuals can take to get there. While copying and pasting everything that I've done, while it may help you reach similar success, it's not the only way that will work. I feel like my advantage in having gone through the experiences that I have is that in hindsight, I can more accurately see the milestones that were most important to my journey. And so what I've done is I've taken everything I've learned these past few years and I've condensed it down into a 3-step framework that I would follow if I were starting my flower farm over completely from scratch. So to start, step 1, it may seem easy, but for a lot of us, it's the most difficult hurdle we face, which is you just have to get started. Within my own journey, one of the things I wish I would have done sooner is stopped dreaming so much about flower farming, and instead I wish I would have rolled up my sleeves and started doing it. In the beginning, I spent so much time overthinking and overanalyzing, and I'm sure many of you can relate, because when you have no experience doing the thing that you want to do, you spend a lot of time researching all the things that you don't know. I spent a lot of my time searching for the right flowers to grow, the right time to harvest, the right ways to sell. And the more that I researched, the more questions I uncovered, which meant that there was no end to all this studying that I was doing. I thought my research was preparing me for my flower farming journey, and while it was helpful, it was also keeping me from getting my hands in the dirt and gaining feedback through experience. Your first flower garden, it may turn out beautiful, or you may look back on the experience and realize it went horribly wrong. But that's not what matters. Once you actually start taking action, those actions can be improved upon. You can't improve upon something that you've never done. And it's all right if you're not naturally gifted at growing flowers. More important than finding out how skilled you are at the growing aspect of flower farming, you first have to decide whether or not you even like the path you're going down. For so many of us, we assume that just because flower farming is a dream of ours, we assume that we're gonna like it. And sometimes we find out, once we get some experience under our belts, that the thing we want to do is not all that we imagine it to be. If you're in this beginning stage of trying to gain clarity around whether or not this is a viable path for you, my best advice is to start small, which I know that's so counterintuitive to the big dreams you have for yourself. But starting small, it doesn't mean that you stay small. I suspect the reason why so many of us fear starting small is that we think growth in business is linear. And so by starting small, we feel like it's going to take us longer to get to our goals. But success in business has a way of compounding itself, and all it takes is for one small success to snowball into substantially larger success. The often underlooked gift in starting small is it allows you the opportunity to bail if things don't work out the way you intend them to. I've shared in plenty of other videos on this channel how my vision for how I wanted my flower farm to run turned out to be very different from the reality that I'm currently living. Specifically, in last week's video, I shared how I'm grateful how I started my first cutting garden planting just low commitment annuals. While those more standard annual varieties may not have been as exciting as the fancier and more costly flowers that I had originally dreamed of, in my mind, I really wanted a garden full of peonies and roses. While those annuals allowed me to switch gears both quickly and easily, while I was still learning how I wanted my flower farm to run. I'm thankful that I didn't get my own way by sort of pigeonholing myself into that one dream. Start small and gift yourself the freedom and the flexibility to pivot if you find that you need to. Realize too that when you're just getting started, the goal isn't to do things perfectly out of the gate. Lessen the pressure that you put on yourself by understanding that you will experience plenty of failure. We all do, it's just a natural part of the process. It's more important that you realize failure is only final when you refuse to learn from it. I can tell you that my deepest and most significant learning has come from doing things completely wrong. For instance, one year I almost ruined my chance of having a garden because I got so eager to plant my seedlings outside that I started planting before our last spring frost. I've missed out on sales before because I forgot how important the marketing and actually sharing about my product was to the whole sales process. And there's been seasons that I've overestimated demand and I've spent more money than I needed to on perishable supplies that could no longer be used. As hard as these lessons were in the moment, they provided me with the important feedback that I needed to guide me on how to move forward. The mistakes I made in the beginning, and quite frankly, the mistakes that I'm still making, they only serve to strengthen and improve everything that comes after them. Now, if you do need some help getting started so you can be one step closer to your goal, don't forget that our garden planning workbook is available in our online shop. It's just $10. Not only will it help you design your first cutting garden if you're new to this whole process, but I also share with you a simple 3x10 cutting garden that you can use as a way to get some valuable experience growing flowers. I'll link that for you in the description box below in case you're interested in learning more. As you gain experience and are sure you want to commit to this path of flower farming, this next step is all about getting clear. Answering the big questions like what, who, where, and how. So first up, you have to get clear on what you're trying to accomplish. You see, the thing about success is it looks very different for each and every one of us. While my goal was always to become a full-time flower farmer, there were a lot of other details that I had to consider. Believe it or not, my goal is not to be the biggest flower farm in my local community. I don't have aspirations of hiring an entire team of employees or acquiring more acreage and expanding the flower varieties that I grow by like tenfold. The way I see it now is that I want the business to be big enough where it supports the kind of lifestyle that I want to live, but it doesn't require my total time and attention so that I can still have a life outside the business. Once I understood what I was aiming for, I got very specific. My goal of working for myself, well, that was tied to a monetary number, and so I knew I needed to have some understanding of what enough meant for me. If my business was going to be how I paid myself, well, how much do I actually need in order to live? And so I sat down and I listed out all of my personal expenses. I also calculated how much net profit my business was making, which in those early years really wasn't a lot. But it was important for me to know where I was starting from and how far I had to go. How far did I have to push the business to grow in order for me to reach my goal? It was during this exercise where I was creating this sort of money plan for myself that I realized that to make the transition of being able to go full-time with my business, well, I could accomplish that by growing my business so that it produced the necessary profits to cover my living expenses, or I could reduce my living expenses, at least temporarily, to minimize how much the business would need to grow. You see, for the first few years of my flower farming journey, when the business wasn't making enough that I could pay myself a sufficient annual salary, well, during that time, I was still working my regular full-time job. In my mind, the sooner I was able to work for myself full time, the sooner I could free up my schedule so that I had more time to devote to the business. And in theory, the more money that I would make. Now, I didn't drastically cut my living expenses in half or reduce the quality of life I was living, but I did cut back on unnecessary spending, like I canceled some of my streaming subscriptions that I wasn't fully using. The two things that I did that saved me the most money was that I shopped around for new car insurance, and I also changed my phone plan. You see, when I was listing out all of my living expenses like I just mentioned, my car insurance and phone bill were two bills that I had set up on autopay for a really long time. The convenience of knowing that those expenses were covered meant that I never bothered with the hassle of shopping around to see if I could get a better deal. I was shocked after seeking out estimates from other companies for my car insurance. I did not reduce my coverage, but just by shopping around and switching companies, I was able to save nearly $200. And the same with my phone plan. My phone plan was so old, my wireless company didn't even offer that plan anymore. And so I upgraded to a newer plan and opted out of the features that I wasn't using and saved another good chunk of money. Saving a couple $100 each month may not be that big of a deal to you, but for me, especially early on, that was less money that I had to rely on my business making, and that meant that I was that much closer to my goal. Getting clear on the what for what I was trying to accomplish was important. But during this phase in my journey, I also took time to get clear on who I was planning to serve with my business. Because who you serve, that informs you of where your revenue within your business is coming from. Deciding on the type of customers you'll serve with your business is likely something that will take a little bit of trial and error. So don't feel discouraged if you don't immediately know who you're growing flowers for. Actually, if you click back a few videos to this one, where I talk about whether or not you should start a flower farm, if you fast forward to the second half of that video, you'll find that I detail the evolution of how I got to the point of finding the unique sales channel that best suited us here at Two Sisters. I shared how it took us trying out everything from selling through a farm stand to selling wholesale to operating as a U-Pick farm and more for us to fully understand what would best work for us. I think it's really easy during this phase of your journey to see what someone else is doing, to see how it's working for them and think that modeling your business after theirs will yield that same kind of success. So often we want to just copy and paste what someone else is doing without any thought of how it would actually feel to have whatever it is that they have. Because that's the thing. As humans, we all have strengths and weaknesses that make us better equipped to handle certain sales channels. For instance, maybe you have dreams of being the flower farmer that everyone raves about at your local farmer's market. You yourself, you visit a market every weekend and you love seeing the flower farmer that's there. You love seeing her stall filled to the brim with brightly colored bouquets, and you can't help but notice how the woman manning the booth looks so engaged talking to the customers that come her way. While it's entirely possible for you to have this same experience, have you stopped to consider what it would look like for your own life? Maybe at the moment you're in a season of early motherhood, where your children are still young and they still need you. Well, does it make sense for you to commit to a farmer's market that may take you out of the house for a while? Or would selling more flowers through fewer customers via wholesale make more sense to you? I often share what works well for us here at Two Sisters, but notice how I usually preference this by saying, this is just my experience. Operating as a 4-season farm like we do, quite frankly, isn't for everyone. I enjoy the fact that by spreading out my workload across multiple seasons, first with tulips in the spring, then with warm season flowers in the summer, followed by pumpkins and mums in the fall, and lastly with wreaths and porch pots in the winter, that it reduces the volume that I need to hit within each season. But spreading my focus across multiple seasons, it does take some juggling. When we hit fall, I'm having to work on garden cleanup, as well as stocking our fall farm stand, and then there's tulips that need to be planted. For some, that juggle can feel overwhelming, and that's why some growers much prefer high-volume sales that are limited to just 1 or 2 seasons. For those people, they like the adrenaline of short bursts of intense activity, followed by longer periods of rest. The lesson in all of this is that there's no right or wrong way to go about building a business. More so, you have to do what makes sense for you. So lastly, within the second phase, you'll have to get clear on how. How will you serve your customers so that the numbers work in your favor? Because when you're running a business, the numbers matter. And don't be tricked. You don't have to have an insanely large business. You don't have to grow acres and acres of flowers to produce a sizable profit. It's not how much money your flower farm brings in that's important. It's how much money are you able to hold on to. If it takes you $100 worth of expenses to generate $50 worth of income for your business, it doesn't matter how big you grow the business. The numbers are never going to make sense in your favor. The mindset shift that I had to make in this phase of my journey was that if I wanted my flower farm to become a business, I had to treat it like one. If I insisted on treating it like a hobby, well, that's what it would always be. Now, as I've said, the first year that I grew flowers, I did start it as a hobby with no intention of turning it into a business. And because growing flowers was something that I did for fun, I didn't allow myself, to spend any more money than I had. I had a finite amount budgeted for my hobby, and once it was gone, that was it. But when I decided I was going to go down the business route with my flower garden, there was that temptation that I should spend a little more. We often think of it as investing in our business. We take a gamble in purchasing more than we can technically afford in hopes that it pays off in the future. Now, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I personally have a low affinity for risk, which means I do run my flower farm more conservatively. That's just a personal choice. But running my business based on what I could afford in the moment, not what I was hoping to afford in the future, that was what ultimately helped me to go full-time faster. For me, I found that when I make decisions based on the available resources that I have, instead of relying on future projections, I don't dig myself into a hole that I can't get out of. In order to do this, though, here's the thing. You can't fight for your limitations. Inevitably, when I share this idea of using what you have available to you, and only what you have available, I get a lot of pushback. People tell me every reason why this won't work for them. They say things like, well, I can't grow flowers because I don't have blank piece of equipment. Or I can't actually grow a business because I don't have time. Or nobody wants to buy blank, so this will never work. Your perceived limitations will stay with you so long as you believe they are real. And so to move beyond this phase of business, you really have to be willing to let go of all the arguments that you have for why this flower farming thing won't work out for you. I challenge you to look at your limitations not as problems to be avoided, but instead as challenges to be solved. That's truly how we got to be the 4-season farm that we are. You see, when I was just starting out, I felt like the biggest hurdle I had to overcome was how could I grow enough flowers so that I could earn a full-time annual income, given my short frost-free growing season, and also given the fact that I didn't have any sort of protected grow space. I didn't, and still don't, have a greenhouse to grow in during the colder months. Rather than dwell on what I didn't have, I chose to get creative with what I did have, which meant I dived into the world of hardy annuals, extending my season in the very early spring by focusing on the flowers that, thrived in the cold and that didn't need extra protection. On the back end, I extended my season into the fall by focusing on planting a crop like pumpkins that, even though they don't grow in the cold, their long shelf life means that we can sell pumpkins even after our first autumn frost has taken out our field of tender annuals. Working solely with what you have, it may be challenging at first, but in my opinion, it allows for a more practical approach to ensuring your business is profitable right from the start. Don't be afraid if you're in this stage of business and feeling stuck. Don't be afraid to expand your definition of what you think a flower farm really is. I think we often hear the word flower farm and assume that means that we have to sell market bouquets to customers. You can be a flower farm and yet not sell a single stem of fresh flowers. Look at Floret as an example. They're a flower farm that more specifically focuses on seed production. When you stop putting limitations on what you believe a flower farm to be, you'll likely find more opportunities that are available to you. Now, phase 2 of this 3-part framework can take a lot of work. I didn't figure out all of the answers to these questions in a single season. Rather, it took me a couple of years to really find my rhythm. There is no definitive timeline to this process. But once I did finally crack the code on what worked for me, the next step was to get efficient. In order for your flower farm to continue operating at the level you grow it to, it has to be sustainable. Otherwise, you're just gonna burn out. Now, there's 2 ways that I've gone about increasing my own efficiency. The first thing I did was narrow my focus. In phase 2, when I was trying out a lot of different ways of running my business, I was casting a very wide net. I was willing to serve anyone that had money because I felt like in doing so, I'd be able to capture more sales. I felt like the way to build my seasons was to offer more. For example, during our spring season, I used to do a seedling sale for my local community. I used to sell dahlia tubers. I also sold fresh tulips and jars of daffodils and a few other random items. The problem with doing so much is that I didn't do any of those things particularly well. I was diffusing my attention, sending it out in many different directions. What really ended up happening was that it lessened the impact I was able to have within my business. Nowadays, rather than going wide, I much prefer to go deep, which is why we narrowed the focus of each season to be just one or two main things. Focusing your attention on just a few things, it allows you to exert more effort into a singular direction, and ultimately is what helps you achieve greater results. So when I was ready to increase the efficiency of my own business, the thing I did was I identified the income streams that made the most sense for me. The what, who, where, and how that best suited me, and I got rid of everything that wasn't that. For me, saying no, especially in relation to sales, it felt scary, but the lesson I learned was that by saying no to everything that didn't make sense for me and my flower farm, it allowed me the space to say yes to the things that did. Now, the other important part of efficiency is leverage. Once I understood how I wanted my flower farm to operate, the question I started asking myself was what systems and processes could I put in place so that I was leveraging my time and effort to the best of my ability. Here's the thing about business. When you work for yourself, you're not paid for your time like you would be if you punched in at a regular job. You're not paid for your time in the sense that if you work 8 hours, there's no guarantee that you're going to make X amount of dollars. The question I always ask myself is, how can I leverage my time so that I'm able to spend more time on income-producing activities? This will take a lot of different shapes and forms as you grow your business. An easy example I can give you is when I was making the decision of whether or not to invest in landscape fabric for my walkways. As I've said plenty of times already in this video, I've always operated my flower farm with the money and resources that I had available at the time. Early on, investing in landscape fabric for my walkways, well, it wasn't an option because I didn't have the money. When money was tight, I more frequently paid for things using my time, which meant in those early years that I'd spend time each week, hoeing the walkways in order to minimize the weeds that sprouted on the bare soil of those walkways. But as my business grew and time became my limiting factor, the investment in landscape fabric, well, it saved me time that I needed to serve customers and generate revenue. Sometimes becoming more efficient with your business and thus scaling your income, it means investing in a piece of equipment that makes it easier to do your job. Sometimes becoming more efficient means delegating work to someone or something else. As my business has grown, I've become more reliant on my website to accept orders and process payments, which was something I used to have to do manually. Sometimes it means that you package your product in a different way. During our winter season, we host workshops where we teach people how to make hand-tied evergreen wreaths. I'm limited in how many people we're able to serve based on the space that I have available and the time I have in my schedule. And to get around this, we started packaging this offer into a wreath kit, which people did at home by following our instructional video. The important thing to realize is that not all action you take within your business will make you money. And the goal with efficiency is finding ways you can spend more time in activities that actually build your brand and business rather than wasting time on tasks that just sort of keep you where you're at. Okay, by now I have covered a lot of information, and I don't know if after hearing what it actually takes to go full time with your flower farm, I don't know if you're more encouraged by the prospect that this can be a reality for you if you want it to be, or if you're watching this video totally overwhelmed. I just wanted to lay out this information and break it down as best I could into an easy to follow framework. I know that I struggled in the beginning with being able to connect the dots. It really took me a while to see how I could go from where I was and eventually get to where I wanted to be. By understanding this framework, I hope you'll begin to realize just how attainable your big goals really are. Now, let me know what you think about this video. If you enjoyed it and found the content helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you let me know by giving this video a thumbs up. It also means so much to me if you hit that subscribe button while you're down there. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Bye guys.